Tonight's speaker is one of the co-founders of PANIC, Prison Abolitionists of Nassau Inciting Change. Stephen Figurasmith will discuss the conditions inside the Nassau County Jail, as well as the history of failed attempts to reform the jail. Stephen will speak about PANIC's mission and goals, why the organization advocates for abolition rather than reform of the prison industrial complex, and how Green Party members can get involved. Stephen co-founded Prison Abolitionists of Nassau Inciting Change in January 2018 to respond to human rights violations against those incarcerated in Nassau County Correctional Center and to build a local movement for a world without police and prisons. Stephen Figurasmith is a parent and a preschool music teacher. Please welcome Stephen Figurasmith.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me here to present and discuss prison abolition and Nassau County Jail with you. I'm very happy to be here. So, like Cassandra said, I am a co-founder of PANIC, and I have here some printouts of our mission statement and vision that I'll just pass out now. You can take one and pass it down. Basically, let's see. We're gonna do loosely follow the slideshow. The slideshow hasn't actually been updated in a while since 2018. So we're gonna go through it to the end and then kind of pick up where it leaves off. I thought I might have time to update it, but with all the planning of the No New Cops in Hempstead protest that happened on Saturday, that kind of took up all of the time that I thought I might have for updating the slideshow. There we are. The PANIC was formed by myself and a couple other members who we met actually in a different jail reform group called the Nassau County Jail Advocates, and we were working with them for a while, and we're still allied with them, but we decided to break off from that group because there were some ideological and tactical differences in how best to approach a theory of change, So we wanted to take a more explicitly abolitionist approach to addressing conditions in the jail. Let's see. So this is our mission. I think all of you have it in front of you too. But I'll just read it out loud for the sake of, so you don't have to. We are committed to the creation of safe and equitable communities achieved through the abolition of the prison industrial complex and a shift away from criminal justice toward public health. We aim to increase the political power of those imprisoned, advocate for the basic human rights and safety of those incarcerated inside Nassau County Correctional Center, and promote community alternatives to policing and jails based on the principles of harm reduction and restorative justice. So the event that I was just referring to, the protest that we had on Saturday, No New Cops in Hempstead, kind of goes toward that last point in our mission of advocating for alternatives to policing. Prison abolition isn't just about tearing things down, right? It's also about building new systems. People's initial reactions, if they have never heard of the prison abolition movement or ideology before, people's initial reaction is often, well, what are you going to do about people's safety? Rapists and serial killers running around on the street, running amok, when in actuality prison abolitionists care very deeply about safety. It's one of our core principles. We believe that police and prisons are a failed solution to violence and crime in our society, as evidenced by many things. One point is that the United States has the highest incarceration rate per capita, and yet we're not even in the top 10 safest nations. So there's clearly no correlation between the amount of people that we lock up and how safe we are from being victims of violent crime. So we advocate for a shift away from the criminal justice paradigm toward a public health paradigm of thinking about violence and harm, right? I won't even, I like to not use the word crime because like what is crime? It's a social construct. Something is a crime based on what laws are passed, but I really like to talk about harm instead of crime, right? And how do we prevent harm and how do we hold people accountable when they've caused harm to another member of their community or another individual, and how do we respond to that in a way that is true justice, not just retribution, but justice that that leads to healing. Hello, welcome. So. I'll take a pause and let you settle in because we all kind of did introductions.
He's also gonna video.
Cool. Awesome. Head here. Alright, well, so shifting from the criminal justice paradigm to the public health paradigm, we're thinking about things like that, the CDC has that ban on studying gun violence, right? But it's been observed, I can't say proven because we can't study it, it has been observed and maybe perhaps studied more in other countries that gun violence actually functions very similar to a pathogen, right? And that you can really trace, you can trace the movement of violence and the cause and effect of violence from one person to another the same way that the CDC would monitor and trace and try to contain an epidemic. So we feel like we believe that harm reduction approaches to violence can actually have a much greater impact in reducing the amount of violence in our society versus policing, criminalization, and incarceration. And before I move away from our mission statement, I should also just maybe clarify what the prison industrial complex means, or maybe ask y'all, and so this isn't just me like talking for an hour, maybe I can ask you guys to give, if you have your own definition of what you think the prison industrial complex is, we can all just kind of like crowdsource it.
It's basically that the system is set up so that it's if someone's arrested, it's more likely for whether it's drug use or violence, that they're more likely to be incarcerated due to high bail, and the system is set up so that they're going to be returning. There's not a lot of education inside there for them to be rehabilitated and removed. I'll start with that thought.
Well, awesome, yeah. So that's a really important point. That the prison industrial complex, like other systems of oppression, is focused on reproducing itself, right? So prisons are not in the business of reducing recidivism. They are in the business of making sure that they keep their cells full. And so there are a lot of ways that the prison industrial complex accomplishes that goal, in terms of causing more crime by tearing apart the fabric of the community, taking large amounts of people who might be breadwinners or caregivers in their community and removing them in large numbers, creates the conditions where poverty and crime will thrive. And then it's kind of a cliche, but it bears repeating that going to jail and prison teaches people how to be criminals, right? Yeah. Someone might go into jail for unpaid parking tickets and leave. When they've gotten out, they might have lost their job, lost their apartment, they have a criminal record, so they can't find work, and they're left with no other no options, no legal options for survival. So there are many ways that the prison industrial complex is exactly what you said. It's a beast that reproduces itself and reproduces the conditions that sustain itself. Does anyone else have anything to add?
You got entire towns where it's the primary industry, where this is what is employing vast numbers of people is to work in the prison, not to mention all the people who were originally employed creating the physical plant of it. Administrators who, as part of their career of running one institution or another, are encouraged to take a stint of running a prison. It's this huge employment opportunity to be in charge of a bunch of other people that we put in a cage.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that's really important. It's a job creator, and it's an industry, and a very large segment of our economy relies on the existence of jails and prisons. The prison industrial complex, the term actually comes from, I'm sure like a lot more people might be more familiar with the term military industrial complex, which I think Eisenhower, right, coined to communicate his fears that the war machine, what the war machine in America had turned into, was a money-making, profit-driven entity or force that with arms manufacturers and all of the other war profiteers, and that in a similar way that what we were talking about, it's self-perpetuating and it creates the conditions for war and for violence, so that people can continue to profit off of that. And another thing I'll say about the PIC is that it doesn't just include jails and prisons, but it's all of the other parts of our economy that are tied into and connected to that, including policing and probation and parole systems, the telecommunications companies that run that profit off of people making phone calls to their families, the private corporations that use prison labor, the state of California using prisoners for free labor for fighting wildfires, right? People think a lot about and talk a lot about private prisons. Bernie Sanders has a proposal to ban private prisons federally, right? But we view all prisons as for-profit prisons, whether they're private or public. The state is making revenue off of them somehow. Okay, so these are our core beliefs that we've touched on, a lot of them. Police and prisons don't keep society safe, nor are they intended to. Rather, the primary function of police and prisons is to maintain a status quo of racial oppression and gross inequality. Right? The police's motto is, to protect and serve, but we hear a lot more about law and order, right? And that's what it's really about. And if you're enforcing laws and maintaining order in a society that is grossly unequal, then then your job is enforcing that unfair system. Police are there to protect property rights. They're not there to protect human life at the end of the day. As you might have seen recently, the ruling that related to one of the school shootings, that a judge ruled that the police officer didn't have a responsibility to protect human life, basically. So all the cards are on the table. We believe that a safer, more just world is possible if we divest our resources from policing and prisons and invest them into smarter solutions to addressing violence and crime. We've seen that reform efforts have repeatedly failed or backfired. A lot of the times really well-intentioned reforms to the criminal justice system end up having very unintended consequences, and the system is very skilled at adapting to whatever changes may occur. Going back again to the protest that we organized last Saturday, No New Cops in Hempstead, that's one example. We believe that it may be connected to the bail reform laws that are scheduled to take effect in January. We think that the whole rhetoric of amping up policing on violent crime and gang-related crime is part of a strategy that the county is is trying out, experimenting with, and attempting to perfect before 2020 comes, when those laws go into effect, so they can figure out how they're going to keep those 1,200 jail cells full in the county jail when they can no longer hold 76% of the people in there on bail. So they're going to have to start arresting at much higher volumes, and they're going to have to start focusing on charges that are exempted from the bail reform laws, such as gang-related. So that's one example of how the bail reform law is going to have an unintended consequence, and how the system just adapts to whatever reforms we throw at it. So these are parents' core values that we've touched on. So I'm just going to keep skipping ahead. And these are some of our strategies. We believe in transformative rather than a transactional approach to social change, and that we should be building movement, right? Instead of focusing on individual reforms and tweaking the system here or there, that we need to build a broad movement, a groundswell that can have the capacity to really change the entire paradigm, like we were saying before, from criminal justice to public health. And so we do that by targeting institutions and systems, not individuals and minor reforms, organizing from the ground up. So now I want to talk a little bit about the history of Nassau County Jail. Who here was born and raised in Nassau County? 1, 2. There's still like 3, roughly like a third of the room. I'm not going to do math right now, but like, that seems like a third of the room, something like that. Well, I was not. I grew up in Virginia. I've lived in Valley Stream for 5 years. Before that, I lived in Jackson Heights for 5 years. Before that, I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and Amherst, Massachusetts.
Where in Virginia?
Newport News.
Oh.
Peninsula. What's that? Charlottesville. Okay, cool. My brother went to UVA, older brother. So I've only lived here for 5 years. But some of you, those of you who raised your hands might remember some of this, depending on how long you've been around. So in the 1980s, there was a lot of crises surrounding overpopulation and violence and safety concerns at the jail. And there were lawsuits brought that resulted in the jail being ordered to reduce its count. And you can kind of see what I've done is just pasted together a whole bunch of headlines that can kind of demonstrate the trajectory of the story. This is kind of another example too of how we were saying before, how reform efforts often backfire and have unintended consequences when we're not focused on changing the system at its roots. So when the jail was ordered to reduce its count by 50%, then many people were moved upstate, where they may have been much farther away from their family members, and much harder for family to reach them, go visit them. And some people were even shipped to New Mexico. There was, in the late, I think it was 89, there was a jailbreak. 3 people escaped from the jail. And then 6 later, 16 prisoners were freed by mistake. So all these, there was like a series of one after another of these crises and embarrassments for the Nassau County Jail, which led in 1990. Actually, in 1990, where are we getting up to? Yes, here we go. In 1990, Nassau County passed this legislation to create the Board of Visitors. The Board of Visitors is an oversight committee, and I'm using that term very loosely, but they're an oversight committee that is supposed to monitor conditions at the jail and respond to them, right, in some way. So the first thing that happened after the passage of this bill was that no one was ever appointed to the oversight committee for 23 years. They passed this bill, they wrote it into the county charter, that this board of visitors of 7 members had to exist to monitor conditions at the jail, accept, review grievances, and for 23 years, the Nassau County executives, it was the county executives' responsibility to appoint the members, and then after they're appointed, the county legislature votes to approve them. So that didn't happen, and then abuses continued at the jail all throughout the 90s, and in 1999, one detainee was beaten to death. His name was Thomas Pizzuto. And that brought a lot of even more increased scrutiny to the jail and brought the attention of the Department of Justice. So this is some of what happened. The guards were convicted. The family won a $7 million settlement. And the DOJ came in 2005 finally to officially put monitors in the jail. They were in for 3 years. And then in 2008, they left after 3 years, and immediately after they pulled out, Michael Sposato, who at one point was actually a chef in the jail, and rose through the ranks to be appointed as acting sheriff. There was definitely some, what do you call it when you hire your family members and friends? Nepotism. There was definitely some nepotism involved, and I mean, you know how Nassau County works. So he promptly reversed all of the reforms that the DOJ had put in place. And shortly after that, there was a series of suicides. And over the past, since 2010, there are 18 deaths in this slideshow. There have been 3 more since I put the slideshow together.
When did you put the slideshow together?
Early 2018. And we don't actually even, we are waiting for the result of a Freedom of Information request to learn the names of 2 of the people that died in 2018, because they weren't even reported by Newsday. The 3rd death was reported, and in that article it mentions that according to the jail officials, it was the 3rd death that had taken place that year, but the first 2 deaths in September and August were never reported on before that. It was just that when the 3rd death, there's like a short aside that it's the 3rd death, and there's no details about the first 2. So we're waiting on the results of a FOIL request, and hopefully we'll get that soon.
So both of these are after Armor Care was sent packing, and they put in, is there still people who are dying?
Yes. Yeah. And so thank you for bringing that up. So we're gonna talk about armor, and we're gonna talk about NUMC, which is the Nassau University Medical Center, which is right next to the jail. Has anyone ever driven past the jail in East Meadow? Know where it is? So Nassau County, the medical center is right next to it, and that's where.
Close to Eisenhower Park.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I just ask out of curiosity, were any of these suicides suspicious?
Yes. Thank you for asking that. Particularly this man right here at the bottom, Daryl Woody.
Because they look like tough people.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't.
Right. Well, he was on suicide watch in the he was in NUMC on suicide watch when he died, and his family does not believe that his death was a suicide, and has for for over a decade now. Wait, I'm sorry, I think I misspoke. It has not been over a decade, but since Daryl Woody's death, his family has been trying to pursue justice and has gotten nowhere. There are some interesting discrepancies in which cases of deaths of prisoners the county settles and which they do not. You might remember a veteran by the name of Bartholomew Ryan, who committed suicide in the jail, and his family won, I think, an $8 million settlement from the county, so there are some notable differences between his case and Daryl Woody's, one being that he was a veteran, and two being that he was white. But Daryl Woody is a really, I'm going to talk about it for a little more. I think actually, so this is Daryl Woody's brother, Dennis Woody, and this is a sign that he brings around, he brought to a few of our rallies, I'll just let you look at it for a minute. Sorry, I'll stand in the camera's way. You notice that quote in the lower left-hand corner, "All I wanted was my medication, you wouldn't give it to me, I'm sorry, I didn't need them." That was shouted by Daryl Woody, according to several witnesses, as he was removed from his cell, bloodied. He had ripped off a smoke detector from the wall and used it to slash up his face and neck. Because they were refusing to give him his medications for his psychiatric medications, and so he did that as a cry for help to get them to force them to bring him to the hospital. So also, before I move from the sign, I will also point out the "Where's the video?" There was supposed to be a plan to install video cameras in Nassau County Jail going back to when the DOJ was monitoring. The DOJ had mandated, as part of the consent decree, part of their agreement with Nassau County, they had mandated that cameras be installed in areas throughout the jail, and we still don't know to this day whether cameras were installed, but the video that might show evidence of what really happened to Daryl Woody has been destroyed or kept in a black box, or if they were negligent and never installed the cameras in the first place. So that's still a big unanswered question in his case. And so after those 4 suicides that all happened in 1 year, that's when the county contracted with Armor. So I'm gonna stop talking and ask you guys what you know about Armor Healthcare from the last couple of years in the news.
It seems like there was death after death after death while they were, and they were all, a lot of them were obviously easily preventable deaths. And there were stories about about them telling people, "I'm not going to authorize a trip to the hospital for this," and then the person dies, and stuff like that. Now, hearing that 3 people died in 2018, I'm not even so sure anymore how much the rate has decreased. I had always thought that under Laura Curran and the new sheriff, the rate had gone down, but I wonder if the media's just not covering it as much.
Right. Yeah, the media painted, had a good time making Armor the scapegoat of all of the deaths that happened, and certainly Armor did not have clean hands, and I think that it is good that they're gone. But Armour, what most people didn't remember during all that media coverage of Armour when they were trying to, when they were battling over whether they were renewing their contract or not in 2018, was that Armour was the solution to deaths in the jail in 2011. After those 4 deaths, including Daryl Woody's suicides that were found to be preventable, Armour was brought in to fix things in the jail. But then, as you know, the deaths continued, people being denied their insulin, people having cancer that went undiagnosed for years and years, all sorts of different stories. Not all of the deaths have been, not all the investigations are completed. I think the DOJ is still investigating some of them, and some of them are also still in court now. I think Fred Brewington is representing Antoine Brown's family right here, and Antoine Brown was not a medical-related death. His death was that he was beaten to death by other inmates, and the family alleges that the guards sat by and watched and did not act to prevent that from happening. But the vast majority were either mental health related or related to medical negligence. So here's just some more headlines. And then finally, in 2013, remember the oversight board, the board of visitors that we were talking about before? Mangano was forced to appoint 7 people to that board as the result of a lawsuit brought by the Nassau County NYCLU. And here we get to another example of reform that was very good and well-intentioned and had a lot of energy and time and resources put into it to fight this lawsuit to get people appointed to the board. And what have they done since then? Who was appointed to that board? The chairperson of the board, Alonzo Albright, is the vice president of a telecommunications company that is part of the prison industrial complex that sells telecommunications technology to courts and jails. The other 6 members either have other conflicts of interest like that or are just completely unqualified to be on any kind of oversight board like that. And even if they were, they also wouldn't have any, even if the right people had been appointed to the board, they would be pretty powerless to do anything. As it stands, the legislation that created the Board of Visitors doesn't give them any kind of a real authority. They don't have any subpoena power, any investigative power, any enforcement power, so they're really useless.
The board is useless?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's also no system for inmates to submit grievances to the Board of Visitors. When pressed on why they've been so derelict in their duties, their excuse is, well, we haven't received any grievances. Because the grievance system in the jail is that the inmates have to give the grievances to the COs.
Is this the
who
same?
they're usually grieving about.
Is the current Board of Visitors the same one as was appointed by Mangano, or did a different one get appointed?
As far as we know, this is another piece of information that we are waiting to get back from a FOIL request from the county clerk's office. As far as we know, it is the exact same 7 people. Now, Alonzo Albright has been hired as the commissioner, so kind of like Vera Flood's assistant. And so we don't know whether he's still also on the Board of Visitors or not, and we're trying to find that information out. We do know that about half of them had passed the point where their term was up, their term limit had expired, and they were still serving on the board, and the legislature, it had not been brought to the legislature to vote on to reappoint them or not. They were just, no one was paying attention and they just let it keep going. We believe that since we got that information, which we learned from a Freedom of Information request, since we learned that, we believe that they have voted to reappoint. I don't think that Laura Curran appointed any new people, but I could be mistaken, and we will hopefully learn that soon. So these are just more of the deaths that have happened in the last 10 years.
But just a question, in other words, you've asked them, are there new people, and you have to go through like a FOIA request for that?
Yeah.
And you have to know who to make the FOIA request from, or
Yeah.
they're very happy to tell you, well, we don't have any documents like that.
Right. In fact, the first time that we submitted the request and got an answer, it was from the county clerk's office, and now they have a new FOIL person working there, and they told us we have to ask the sheriff's department. So, yeah, we have a runaround.
What about the county where the oversight board, the jail of visitors? No, I probably-
Board of Visitors.
Board of Visitors.
Yeah. It's confusing. That's another thing.
Oh, wait.
Who would even know that the Board of Visitors was the oversight committee of the jail? What a like weird, ambiguous name to give them just so that just to make it opaque, right?
Would-
But what was
could
your
you-
question?
Oh,
Sorry.
could you FOIL the county for the Board of Visitors?
Yes, well that's what we've done.
Okay.
Is to submitted the FOIL request asking what are the names of the people serving on the Board of Visitors and when their term limits expire, because we want to be ready the next time one of them is up for reappointment. We want to be able to be ready to perhaps propose our own candidate, right?
Sure. Be proactive.
Yeah, because one of PANIC's campaigns, one of the things that we believe is that the Board of Visitors should be entirely staffed by formerly incarcerated people.
Yeah.
There's legislation sponsored by legislator Sheila Bino, who I do not remember which district she represents now. Does anybody know? Well, she's one of the 11 legislators in the Nassau County Legislature, and she's sponsored legislation which was co-written by the NYCLU to reform the Board of Visitors, but we think that there still are a lot of problems with it, including that part of the legislation is to mandate that people with corrections and policing experience be on the board, but it doesn't mandate that anyone with experience being incarcerated, with first-hand experience being an inmate in Nassau County Jail should be on the board. Not even one person. We would like it to be all 7.
Yeah.
But, right?
So of the 7, do we know that there were 7 appointed? Because
We
that's
do.
how many seats. Do you know the original 7 that were appointed?
I have that information, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
I just want to know if you knew that.
I know that one of them was like a school board member. The only one that I recall by name is Alonzo Albright, because he was the chairperson.
You said he's also a commissioner?
He is now the commissioner of the sheriff's department.
Oh, okay, thanks. I was confused.
It's like a bit of a conflict of interest.
That's basically right, and there was the original conflict of interest that he was the vice president of the
Yeah, but
telecommunications
this is-
corporation. So yeah, the full circle conflict of interest. Alright, yeah, so you see how like all of the media attention focused on Armor. You know that some of the stuff that went down with Armor was that in in other states they were already banned from renewing contracts. For several years they were banned in Florida from renewing any contracts with correction facilities because of all of the deaths that had been happening there. And Nassau County kept their contract with them, even I think renewed it once. After that already happened, after they were already being investigated by the New York State Attorney General. Yeah. This is, there are some lawsuits right now. Eric Slutsky, I believe is still in the courts now. So this is interesting because this came out, this story came out just a little bit after the Nassau County Jail Advocates held a press conference at the county legislature with Sela Bino and several other county legislators to promote the legislation reforming the Board of Visitors. Now, one thing that happened at that event was that we had many signs, and one of them said, "End correctional officer brutality." Now, the Correctional Officer Union, the Nassau County COBA, the Correctional Officers Benevolent Association, jumped on that, and they had their own press conference the very next day, right where we had stood, demanding that all of those legislators resign and chastising us. Shame on you for being so disrespectful of our correctional officers and these unfounded accusations that they're violent toward inmates. And the coalition, the Nassau County Jail Advocates, ended up releasing a statement basically backtracking and apologizing for that sign. And that is one of the things that led to some PANIC members breaking off from that group because we felt like we should be standing up for our values and not bending over backwards to preserve relationships with those legislators.
So the Nassau County Jail
Advocates. So because those legislators, Sela Bino called the NYCLU furious that they had been embarrassed by standing with us next to that sign, and all the legislators released their own statements saying they had no idea that that sign was there and they respect the correctional officers and yada yada yada. Every politician that runs for election in the Nassau County Legislature, Democratic and Republican, seeks the endorsement of the Correctional Officers Union. Sela Bino had been there 2 weeks before our press conference, had been to a meeting with them asking for their endorsement. And so she was pretty mad that we had angered them. And the powers that be at the NYCLU wanted to preserve their relationship with her, and so they refused to push back against the rhetoric coming against us from the union. And then literally 1 or 2 weeks later, this lawsuit came into the news. Yeah.
But she's not a legislator anymore.
She is.
What's her name?
Sela Bino. It's spelled S-E-I-L-A B-Y-N-O-E.
Can you just clarify, it's not the Nassau County Jail Legislative Advocates, or it is?
The legislative is not in there, it's just
Oh.
Nassau County Jail
Okay,
Advocates.
and what's the NYCLU? That's
That's the Nassau,
I got it.
no, I'm sorry, the NYCLU is the New York Civil Liberties Union.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry, I should have clarified that, I shouldn't assume that everyone knows all the alphabet soup.
Oh, I see,
Yeah,
yes.
they're like the ACLU, the Nassau it's the Nassau County chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union.
So Jim,
Yeah.
what is?
Yeah, she's second district, yes.
Second
And
district.
I should have clarified that NYCLU, the NYCLU, is one of the members of the Nassau County Jail Advocates. So that's why I was going back and forth talking about both of them.
Okay, thanks.
So here's some statistics about Nassau County Jail. Pre-trial means that those people have not been convicted of a crime. Somebody might currently, until January, when bail reform goes into effect, somebody might be held on bail and not be brought in front of a judge for a trial for weeks, months, or even over a year in Nassau County Jail. And 76% of the approximately 1,200 people are pre-trial, have not been convicted of a crime. That's why we think that all these increases in policing, and it's not just this current influx of the state troopers being brought to Hempstead, but also in March there was something called the Hempstead Initiative. Did anyone read about it? So the Hempstead Initiative was an operation by Nassau County PD to basically crack down on Hempstead, and they made 200 arrests within 30 days. So we really feel like even though bail reform hasn't gone into effect yet, that they're trying to perfect their strategy of how they're going to change policing in Nassau County to compensate for not being able to keep 76% of the beds full of people waiting for a trial, right? Because you know that they're not going to let that many correctional officers lose their jobs. They're not going to downsize the jail as the result of bail reform. They're going to figure out another answer. Immigration holds also. Y'all know that ICE has a trailer at the jail. And Lori Curran initially called for ending cooperation with ICE. And then when the PBA, the Police Benevolent Association in Nassau County, pushed back at her and kind of bullied her in the press about it, she backtracked. And she said, oh, well, we're gonna just move it from the jail to the hospital. And then many immigrant rights advocates and other people were sounding the alarm that no, that's actually even worse. So she moved it back to the jail, and that's the status quo again, where it sits today. Yeah. So the average length of stay is 23 days. But like I said, some people are there for 1 day, some people are there for over a year. If it's an average of 23 days, imagine going to jail for 23 days, how much of a destructive impact that can have on somebody's life when they get out. They've lost their apartment, they've lost their job, they've lost custody of their children. Whether they were found innocent or had the charges dropped or anything. In fact, I myself lost my job, not because I was in jail for a prolonged period of time. I spent one night in, not even in the jail, I spent one night in a holding cell in the basement of one of the police departments, and then I spent some of the next day in the jail. But because of false accusations, false charges brought against me for a protest that I was engaging in, we had props to symbolize, there were bottles filled with red water, and they were labeled on them. They were labeled water. It says safe and non-toxic on the labels, and yet they said that I was that was a fake bomb, that I had intended for that to look like a fake bomb. It was supposed to represent the first plague in the story of Passover, when Moses brings plagues against the Egyptians to free the slaves, because we were holding a protest against forced inmate labor, against prison slavery. Because of them sending my mugshot to the press with this false charge that I was responsible for a bomb scare at the legislature, I lost my job. So that was fun.
Did you get it back?
No, I did not. But it's okay because I'm doing pretty well freelancing now. Yeah. So I want to also point out the percentage of charges that result in conviction is pretty low, especially for misdemeanors. But even 2 out of 10 for felonies is not great either. So what does that mean if you do the math, saying that with the number of people in the jail, they're there for an average of 23 days, so it's actually a lot more than 1,200 people go through the jail each year. Multiply 1,200 by 365 and then divide that by 23, and I guess that's probably roughly how many people go through the jail each day. And of that number, 2 out of every 10 people arrested for a felony and 4 out of every 10 people arrested for a misdemeanor are not found guilty. and many more who do result in conviction are taking a plea deal, whether they're guilty or innocent, taking a plea deal just to get out, to get home to their families, so they don't wait a whole year in jail just for a trial, right? So the percentage of people who are innocent is probably significantly higher than that. So that's how many false arrests are happening in Nassau County Jail Nassau County every year. So this is some of the issues with the conditions taking place in Nassau County Jail, and PANIC is currently doing a project to collect more testimony, to learn more about all of these issues, and that's where our letter writing event this coming Saturday comes in. We have a list of inmates who have agreed to give written testimony on the conditions, so we're asking individual people to take responsibility for communicating with them, kind of like striking up a pen pal relationship, and also collecting that testimony so that we can compile it. We hope to get testimony from dozens of people so that we can really start exposing the conditions, because the Board of Visitors is not doing it. The Board of Visitors is not going into the jail. The Board of Visitors is not soliciting grievances or testimony from the prisoners, and somebody needs to do it. We've talked about this.
What was the keep lock?
Oh, keep lock is when prisoners are kept in their cell for up to 23 hours a day and only allowed out for 1 hour. And so in Nassau County Jail, they say that they don't have any solitary confinement. Whenever there have been calls in solitary confinement in Nassau County Jail, their answer is, we don't have a SHU, we don't have the SHU, the solitary housing unit. What they do have, number one, is the behavioral modification unit, where they primarily send prisoners with mental health issues, and we learned that they keep the lights on 24 hours a day in the behavioral modification unit, which is a form of torture. And they specifically are housing people already experiencing mental health issues and depriving them of sleep. So that's one form of administrative segregation that happens in the jail, and the other thing is keep lock, when because they don't have the SHU anymore. I think they used to, and then there was some renovations. So instead they use keep lock, which is keeping people in their cells for up to 23 hours a day, which is against New York State laws. Some of the unsafe living conditions that we've gotten already, we've gotten some testimony returned from prisoners, includes rat droppings in the food, mold growing on the walls. We talked about this. This picture down here with the woman holding the sign that says "Board of Visitors, do your job." She's a great person. Her name is Serena Liguiri. I hope I'm saying her last name right. And she is one of the leaders of an organization called New Hour for Women and Children. They're based in Brentwood. That was a picture from that press conference and protest that I was telling you about before, with the legislators and the backlash from the CO union. That's where that picture is from. Alright, so as you can see, like I said before, I did not update the slideshow since the last time we worked on it in 2018, because we were busy planning the new Hempstead, No New Cops in Hempstead rally. But these are some of the campaigns that we were focused on in 2018. We are still focused on all of these, but we've added some, like the focusing on pushing back against the over-policing in communities of color in Nassau County, so I'll talk a little bit about Nassau Jail votes. but I want to check how much time we have left first, because
It's o'clock.
it's 8:30 already. Wow. So real quick then, ideology, right? It's not just a difference of ideology; it's also a difference of strategy and tactics. And so this gets into some of that. That we're focused. We're not focused so much on building organizations. You know, like PANIC is not a 501c3. We're not incorporated. We don't currently have bylaws, although we are in the process of creating some. But in general, we're not focused on organization building. We're focused on movement building. We want to only pursue reforms that are going to have the effect of altering the balance of power. Because if you implement reforms, but the balance of power remains the same, then power just adapts to those reforms. So getting prisoners better access to voting, and having formerly incarcerated people on the oversight committee, those are things that can perhaps have more of a transformational effect and have less of the chance of unforeseen
May I have your attention,
consequences.
please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes. If you wish to buy materials, please come to the checkout desk now. The public computers will be turned off in 15 minutes. Thank you.
So if you want to get involved with PANIC, you can come to our letter writing campaign on Saturday, or if you can't make it there, we usually try to have a meeting about once a month, and I think that we're going to start having every one of our meetings also be a letter writing event. We found that you can have a meeting and have a lot of people show up and agree to write letters, but then they don't all do it when they get home. So instead, we're just going to have people write the letters right there at the meeting. So that's our new approach. So if you can't make it next Saturday, we will definitely be having another one in September, another one in October. Our Facebook page is PANIC. The tag is @516PANIC. If you're looking for it, or you just type in Prison Abolitionists of Nassau, it'll come up, and we post all of our events there and everything. I think.
Curious, how did you get involved in this kind of movement and prison reform on a personal level? So you obviously know a lot about it. You've been working for a while. How did you get involved in this particular issue?
Well, how I came to be passionate about prison abolition and that to be my primary lens that I approach social justice through was really through intersectional feminism and the lessons that I learned from that and from reading the work and seeing the work of Black women organizing against state violence and struggling with how to reconcile resisting state violence and resisting intimate violence at the same time, right? So the second wave feminist movement, which is predominantly middle class, predominantly white in the 60s and 70s, focuses on carceral responses to gendered violence, right? Like the police are the answer to protect women from abusers, for instance, which works a lot better for privileged, affluent white women than it does for women living in communities where the police are another aggressor, where they might, by calling the police, if they're in a violent situation with a partner, by calling the police, they might be putting themselves at greater risk, or they might not want that partner to be incarcerated because they might still be dependent on them. Having that person arrested and incarcerated might not actually be the smartest or most effective way to keep that person safe. Someone who is undocumented cannot rely on our criminal justice system to address intimate gender partner violence. So that's the issue that first brought me to to looking at like other systems, alternative systems for creating safe and healthy communities besides police and prisons, and not relying on an oppressive state to keep us safe and needing new solutions. Some of those organizations are Sister Song and Incite Women of Color Against Violence, and they actually have a really awesome statement on state and intimate violence that they released in like 2008 or 9, and I think it's like still really powerful and really inspires me and drives the work that I do.
I did want to ask you, you said there was an article in Newsday that casually mentioned something about the third death, and it mentioned the name of the third death, but not the other two. What was that name?
And I'm
You don't
remiss
have that
because I don't remember it, but I can definitely look it up right now. I just sent an email with it earlier today, but it just escapes me off the top of my head right now. Kevin Rollins.
Kevin Robbins was
Kevin Rollins. His last name is Rollins.
and he's the third death in 2018.
Yeah, and there were very little details reported about the circumstances surrounding his death.
But that was in an article in Newsday, that name.
Yeah.
Do you happen to remember the date of the article? Or?
I think it was, yes, the date of the article was December 31st, 2018.
Happy New Year.
And now they're telling you that for any information about that, the FOIL should go to the sheriff's department.
We sent the FOIL. I had sent the FOIL initially, originally to the sheriff's department for that. It was another FOIL request that I was talking about to get the information about the Board of Visitors.
Right.
That originally we had requested it from the county clerk because that's who responded and gave us the information a couple of years ago. But now, this time they've said we have to send it to the sheriff's department, so we resubmitted it to them.
And what you resubmitted to them was the question about the Board of Visitors.
And it's definitely been over their time limit for responding. So
Well, I was going to ask about that too. For Kevin Rollins, did you ask him about that also, and who the other people who died in 2018 were?
Yeah, so the specific information that we requested was the names of the two people that were unnamed in that article, and any information available about the circumstances of their death.
And are they over the time limit for that too? Or?
No, they're not over the time limit for that yet. They have that we just submitted that recently. They have like 20 days to respond the first time, and then on the 20th day, all they really have to do is send you a message saying they need more time, and they can have like another 30 days. But,
So they're entitled to 50 days without being in violation of anything, not that you could do anything to them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, all they have to do to not be in violation is just like send you a message saying like we can't tell you, or or that we need more time. But they haven't even actually bothered to send the we need more time message for the FOIL request about the Board of Visitors. So I need to follow up on that.
The one time when we do see our legislators, our county legislators and the candidates is just before the election. That's really the one time when they're in a position they have to answer questions and stuff. I'm wondering what would be some good things to ask them.
Well, what do you guys think? Like based on all the information that you just learned.
Are you pro putting someone who was formerly incarcerated onto the Board of Visitors? Good question.
That would be a great question to ask the legislators, or even, are you for it, or like why are there no formerly incarcerated people?
But either way, you're
right
telling us
now?
the Board of Visitors is totally toothless anyway.
Yeah.
And so would it really help much if you have this totally toothless board which now has...
I think so, and this is why. because the people on the Board of Visitors now are not advocating for themselves to get more authority.
Right.
And
By
so-
design. They don't wanna make waves.
They're happy
Right.
being a rubber stamp.
Yeah, exactly. So if there were, right, it's kind of like a chicken and the egg thing. Like, yes, appointing formerly incarcerated people on the Board of Visitors, they still would not have the authority yet, but they might be able to, that would still amplify their voice, and they might be able to advocate for the Board of
They might
Visitors
be more
getting more
inclined to
authority.
speak out.
I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
I know that in the days of Armour, New York State was investigating all these deaths, or a lot of the deaths that happened. Was that Spitzer, who was the guy who was actually investigating each death and producing
Well,
a
who was the
report?
AG Schneiderman?
I think so.
Yeah, so yeah, Schneiderman would, I mean, I don't know if he was the person personally overseeing the investigation, or if it
yeah,
was someone
his name was on
working
it,
for
and he
him, yeah.
Announcing it at a press conference and stuff. But
yeah.
now we don't know, as far as we know, he's not still doing that. He hasn't investigated Kevin Rollins, or he hasn't told us about it, or.
Yeah, I don't think that the Attorney General's office is. I don't know. I just don't know the answer to that. I hope so. One thing though is that to point out that Nassau University Medical Center is now who is responsible for all of the healthcare in Nassau County Jail, and they were the ones who were in charge of healthcare before Armour came in. So they basically they went from NUMC to Armour, and then when Armour didn't work out, NUMC was presented as the solution rather than trying to actually.
And UNC before.
May I,
Yeah, we need to.
let's have some other questions.
please.
Have you encountered any alternative to incarceration programs that seemed like genuine alternatives that had a constructive way of approaching the situation that wasn't just giving lip service, either here on Long Island or elsewhere?
So most alternative to incarceration programs are unfortunately still a part of the like surveillance leg of the prison industrial complex, right? Like probation is often put forward as like, you know, like people who are channeled into an alternative to incarceration program are either mandated to seek substance abuse treatment or put on probation or both. And as someone and as an organization that advocates for the complete abolition of the system, those aren't ideal alternatives.
Agreed.
So I can't, but I would point to solutions that are working currently to prevent crime, like there was something featured on The Daily Show a few months ago. A small a town, I think outside of San Diego in California, is paying gun offenders to not commit crime, basically. Sounds like a crazy idea, but it's working. And it's not just that, but they're also sponsoring travel and stuff to like send people who have never been out of their neighborhoods to to wilderness areas and to like theme parks and just whatever, like life enriching experiences that can reduce someone's incentive and drive to cause harm to other people. Right, like there are, and in Long Island, the programs that I would highlight are Strong Youth. They do really great youth violence prevention and gang prevention work with the youth in Brentwood, and I think they have an office right here in Freeport. I think that's actually, or is it Union? No, I'm sorry. In Uniondale is their first office, and then they've expanded to Brentwood as well. Strong Youth. There's another organization called Man in the Mirror, who works with people returning from incarceration, and they're based in Suffolk. And there's Heaven, Help End Violence Now, And those are the kind of programs that we'd like to see more resources being taken from policing and put into those violence prevention programs. But the alternative to incarceration programs that are under the auspices of the state are really still a form of social control that we don't advocate for.
Are there any international? Have you only looked nationally
Yeah.
or?
Well, in some Scandinavian countries, they have, like in Finland, they have like open prisons where even people who are convicted murderers have the keys to their cells and they come and go and they work in the community, and it's just a very vastly different model and approach. So yeah, like there are definitely internationally, there are examples of better ways to do it.
Norway is probably the most notable. They encourage inmates to learn a trade, move towards what their life will be outside of prison, rather than just keeping them locked up and then releasing them. The thing, I'm not sure if it's Norwegian or Californian.
May I have your attention, please? The library is closing at 9 p.m. Please bring all material to checkout desk now. All public computers will be turned off at this time. Storage bins are not unavailable. Thank you.
That's the last announcement.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, then at 9 they tell you to get out.
There's a move to have more female correctional officers in men's prisons. And that is so that the men who are in the prisons can become accustomed to dealing with women in a respectful way. And we don't have that now in prisons. Primarily male correctional officers are dealing with the male prisoners, and so the prisoners are not interacting with women in a respectful or constructive way at all. And so is it any surprise that then women are perpetrated against when those people get out of prison and commit a crime?
I'd like to add to that 40% of law enforcement families experience domestic abuse, at least, and that's based on self-reporting, so it's probably actually much higher. So we think about the prisoners are the ones that need help knowing how to interact respectfully with women, but the correctional officers themselves are probably are often just as violent and just as misogynistic.
Well, and that's just kind of a societal thing. I think it's not exclusive to correctional officers. Just very quickly, I Googled the article in Newsday from the 31st of December. The last paragraph has information about the two other deaths. It has the ages and the months that they died.
The age, yeah, it says September and August.
According to authorities, according to Bridget Murphy, who's the reporter. So that information's out there in some form.
Right, the ages were also included. So yeah, I didn't mention that, but what we'd like is the names and the causes of death.
I had heard about an experimental program, but I don't remember where it was. It was a small community. And when someone was facing charges, they would give them the option of meeting with the injured parties, the law enforcement officials who had arrested them, what they had observed at the time. And they would discuss what had happened and what they thought would be some way out of this situation, and see if they could reach some sort of mutual meeting of the minds that would enable them to table the matter and sort of suspend the charges. It still probably involved a lot more surveillance and monitoring and so forth post hoc, but it seemed like an opportunity to move towards a more communication-based resolution and less geared towards authority and getting some allegedly objective decision that somebody is or is not guilty, etc.
Right. So that sounds like an example of restorative justice, where and that's often actually done. I learned recently in some places they're starting to use more restorative justice approaches. It won't always necessarily be the actual perpetrator of the crime and victim of the crime the victim of that same perpetrator, but it might be a victim of a similar crime and a perpetrator of a similar crime, and then they may, because it could be like triggering for the victim to, right, the victim might not want to actually like be in the same room across from someone who's caused them harm, but it often can be that having someone who's been the victim of a similar crime can communicate to the perpetrator what their experience was and what effect on their lives that crime has had, and a lot of it is focused on like building empathy, right? And also and on healing. That true, justice doesn't have to be about retribution and revenge. We believe that it should be about healing instead. And if somebody murders someone's child, there might be other ways besides sending that person to jail for life, to prison for life, or executing that person, that they could give back to the family that they took a life from in more constructive ways. And we don't have all the answers. Prison abolitionists do not have all the answers, and I do not claim to, and I don't think anyone's claiming to have all the answers. I have sometimes heard it proposed that somebody should have to work a certain number of years for a family, right? Like if I took someone's child's life, that I should be indebted to perform to work for that family for a certain number of years, but that also verges into advocating for a form of slavery as punishment for a crime, right? So there are everything is not black and white, but we believe that that we have to go somewhere different from where we are now and seek out new alternatives. Yes.
Not really a question, it's kind of a story, but 2 weeks ago, I live in a co-op, and there's a pool deck outside my window, and somebody drags a aluminum chair against the concrete right by my window, and so it wakes me up in the morning, my 60-month-old son and wife, even on the weekend. So I happened to be on the terrace on 2 Saturdays ago, and I happened to see this person dragging the chair, and I asked, would you please not drag the chair? Maybe there's a smaller chair if you could take it and lift it. And the person refused and said, "Oh, you people on the pool deck think you're so privileged." And I said, "Well, I'm just asking you because it wakes me up, wakes my family up." And she's like, "You think you're the only ones who wake up?" It basically came to, tough, you're gonna have to live with it. And I said, "Well, that's not fair." And I said, "You're gonna have to live with," and I got a trombone, and I started playing a trombone. And then she took a cup of water and she threw it on my toe. So, which I had a couple nights before an issue where I was at the medical emergency clinic because I seared all of my blood vessels trying to fly a kite for
Too much information.
Anyways, so I got really upset because she basically went up to my terrace, threw it over the railing onto me. I wasn't on fire. It didn't, justify her throwing water on me. And I called the police, because my son was also right next to me. Could have, and the police basically said, and she's not even a shareholder on the building. So I said, just help me out. I don't understand how it's okay for her to throw water on me. And he said, well, you have to take it up with your board in your building, your co-op board. So I guess it was just going back to what you said earlier, that it's just all law and order, and it's not about, not necessarily protecting and serving, but even just conflict mediation. We don't have even that with our, not at least this issue experience. But I think it's helpful what you said about what Alan was raising, just all the alternatives. We don't know the answers, but fathers don't know the answers to what problems may arise to when children are going to be knocking into each other. You don't want to necessarily blame one and then cause resentment, and And then that's something that fuels them wanting to only know what they do when that experience happens. So it's what we have today isn't working, and we need to definitely problem solve it.
Right, yeah, thank you. And prison abolition is not about removing all consequences for behavior that breaks norms or that causes harm, right? It's the fact that our current system of consequences is based, going hundreds of years back, on a system of genocide and slavery and oppression, and that all of the forms of oppression that shape our society directly feed into and support and are the very basis of our current system of policing and of policing behavior. And there's no true that accountability and healing is not the priority, and conflict mediation is not the priority. The priority is replicating replicating the inequalities of society and reproducing those conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.